Okay, so at the moment I'm working on two books, and they complement one another, and it's been a while that these two projects have been ongoing. The first is called Demystifying the Middle East, and it's a general book about introducing the region to an American and Western audience. The second book is based on my dissertation, which I wrote about 10 years ago. It's a monograph on the history of Amman. Something interesting happened along the way, which is that I discovered that there was a mini Orientalism going on in the field. There was a reaction, obviously, well-founded against traditional Orientalism. And so you had scholars going to the region and trying to write corrective books about the urban history and social history of the Middle East. And they did well, but they ignored certain urban centers. They ignored large swaths of territory. And in the process, they maybe reproduced a kind of Orientalism by denigrating the history of Jordan, the history of Amman. There was a tendency in the field to promote work on Egypt, on Syria, on Lebanon, um, maybe at the expense of other countries and other regions and other urban centers. In particular, Amman was not as interesting to historians because of a multitude of maybe myths and misconceptions about it, and that was unfortunate. And now the general trend in the Middle Eastern studies landscape in North America and in Europe, the general trend is that this is beginning to change, and people are beginning to go to the region more and visit and discover a lot of new material. So my book, I use an eclectic range of sources. For example, these are just some sample sources that I've used. Some of them are in English and some in Arabic. For example, British military records and the political records, travel narratives, colonial office records, Arab memoirs, contemporaneous accounts from various Western papers. Um, in Amman, back when I started this research in 2006, it was initially difficult to research the city and to find documents. Probably the task of the historian studying this part of the Middle East is maybe more difficult than somewhere that's more established, where there are more records. But one place that was very helpful and that improved over time was the Department of the National Library in Amman. Initially, their records were not digitized; they were difficult to use. But over the years, they digitized their material, and it became much more welcoming for a scholar. There's a lot there on, baladiyat records, communications, financial records, things like that. For example, when I was studying the 1970 civil conflict in Amman, I found records of how much the government had to pay in order to rebuild certain areas of the city that had been destroyed. So it's possible to find such records. It's difficult. There is some red tape sometimes. You need to be diligent and to be patient. I also conducted a lot of oral history interviews. Basically, my goal was to write a general history. And as a political and social historian, I obviously tended to focus on the people of Amman, how they accommodated to different changes. I talked about things like imperial continuity in terms of administration, refugee absorption, how people came in, how they were treated by their neighbors, how they were able to adapt to new conditions. Um, I also wanted to bridge the gap between Arabic language and foreign language primary and secondary sources, because I noticed that a lot of the literature that exists on this subject tends to focus on one or the other type of source material. So sometimes the source material is exclusively in English. Sometimes it's just in Arabic, and I wanted to use obviously both. And I've used material in other languages as well, but I focused on English and Arabic, and I used a variety of sources. Some of the arguments I've made, one argument is acknowledging the role of Amman's inhabitants and the agency of the Ottoman Empire in creating modern Amman. This is often forgotten, and there's not much in schools in Jordan about the critical role that the Ottomans played in resettling Amman in the late 19th century and in building up some institutions in the city in the early 20th century. And of course, the role of the Circassians and Chechens in the beginning is also important. I also wanted to resist conventional periodizations, and rather than start the history of Amman in 1878 or in 1921, I wanted to stress continuities that carried over from pre-Ottoman to Ottoman to British and Hashemite rule. And there are a lot of interesting stories that come out of this type of history. Some things that, even as somebody who grew up in Amman, I never knew about. For example, the role of an Ottoman vizier, Kamel Pasha. He thought of the idea of settling Amman and he wanted to create a vilayet, an entire province around Amman. But then they changed their minds and decided to settle the city, but not to make it as a provincial center, but as a more localized center that had some sort of military importance. Um, and I also go back, I mean, the first chapter is about Amman's pre-modern and pre-Ottoman past. I talk about, the etymology of Amman, where the word comes from, the different theories on that, the geography, the different eras, just a little bit as an introduction, the Amman under the early Islamic empires, Amman before, under when it was called Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And I thought about calling the book The City of Brotherly Love, but it sounds a little corny, so I might not use that, but there's a lot of rich material in here. Another argument is that I emphasize class categories more so than ethno-national or religious differences. I argue that there's a unique quality in Amman citizen residents, in that most of them are not indigenous to the city. Even East Bank Jordanians who live in Amman are from other areas, most of them, except for a few tribes. So the fact that people were always moving to Amman and fleeing difficult conditions, whether it's poverty or war or revolts, um, created a certain kind of atmosphere in the city that's almost tranquil, a calm, serene kind of atmosphere. This is perhaps why Amman has not been that interesting to scholars who are more excited by the chaos of Cairo or the coffee shops of Beirut. But ironically now, scholars here are sending their graduate students to Amman because the other places have become very difficult to send people to. So this part of Amman's harmonious character is actually helping generate new research about the city and about Jordan in general, which is great. One more argument I have is of a theoretical nature, which is that I challenge Benedict Anderson's imagined communities. Benedict Anderson was a very major scholar of political science. And he wrote a book called Imagined Communities, in which he argued that that people living within a nation imagine themselves as linked with one another, but in a way that's territorially limited. And Amman, of course, is different. The way residents feel about the city historically and about Jordan in general has not been so limited. It's much more fluid. They thought of themselves as being part of one urban center and one country, but also they had so many connections from outside, and many of them had families in different areas, and it was much more porous, people going back and forth. It was a much more cosmopolitan conception of identity than Anderson's theories allow. So these are my major arguments. And I just want to walk you through some anecdotal material, some quotes, some pictures that maybe will help illustrate some of the directions I'm going in this book. This is a quote from National Geographic from 1923, and they call Jordan Transjordania. Um, and they say here that Amman and the larger city of Salt are full of men who have cheated the already overcrowded French prisons. And Professor Muhammad Khalid mentioned earlier the role of French suppression in places like Lebanon, and how that led to people coming to migrate to Amman. Anyway, let me continue the quotation here. Some secure passports and continue into Palestine and Egypt. Others are given government appointments and remain in the desert kingdom, all awaiting a time when they can return to their own country and harboring an undying bitterness against the neighbor on the north. But you see the instrumental part of the quote, or the key part, is that last sentence, all awaiting a time when they can return to their own country. So that's part of what I'm talking about. Amman's increased political centrality was illustrated in the aftermath of the 1948 conflict. There's a quote here from Life magazine, 1948. They describe Amman as the political Mecca of the Middle East. And they say, sorry, the quotation cut here, but they say that the Arab Legion, the Jordanian army's victory at Jerusalem, makes Amman the center of political activity in the Arab world. Um, the rapid growth that the city experienced after these massive conflicts was considerable. One source refers to it as a Houston-like boom. Houston in Texas had an amazing boom due to the oil boom, and it grew into a large city with the urban sprawl. So they were comparing Amman even to Houston, Texas. And you see this mushrooming of the population from 1871 to 1946, and of course after 1946 as well. So this research leads you to explore some very cool sources, very interesting source material. There's an excellent book by the Jordanian historian Nufan Mahmoud, who goes through a lot of the records and establishes, how many households lived in Amman, how many tents, etc. And you can see it was still a very small urban center by 1930, but the Ottomans, as I said, had already set in motion the conditions prior to World War One for Amman to develop into a key urban center. This is just a snapshot of Jordan's political history and some key moments after 1878, although I try to resist this periodization, include the founding of the Hijaz Railway. And of course, by 1908, it was operational in Amman. And that was one way through which the Ottomans felt that they could solidify control over the caravan routes and pilgrimage routes that linked Damascus to Medina. And in this vision, they saw or they envisaged Amman to be a key center on along the railway lines. Then it's selected as the capital of Transjordan, 1928, over salt. There's all these theories about why, some less interesting than others. Um, More refugees begin to come in Amman, and it's an amazing story of how they were accommodated and welcomed by the indigenous population in Jordan. Some in the beginning had to seek shelter in the Roman theater, for instance, and then were given apartments or help, and then there were camps. Um, this led to an increase in the population, and you saw with Professor Khalid's very nice presentation earlier how he talked about some of the institutional manifestations of this growth, some of the buildings, etc. I won't go through that. I won't repeat all of that. But the one part of this book that was challenging for me was the my chapter on the 1970 to 71 conflict, because it could be argued that it doesn't fit into the general narrative I'm proposing, which is that this is a socially harmonious place and a uniquely socially harmonious place as far as Levantine cities are concerned. But I argue that actually that conflict was not a civil war between Palestinian Jordanians and East Bank Jordanians, but rather a more limited conflict between the Fidaiyin groups and the Jordanian government. And I try to present evidence to support that contention. And then, of course, Amman, since 1971, is a pretty interesting narrative, but I don't dedicate a lot of space to that because I'm not an urban planner or an architect, and as a historian, there are limits to how much insight you can give for such much more recent history. Although I argue that what's happened since still fits into this general theory that I'm proposing. With Iraqis coming in, with Syrians coming in, there has been some integration and there has been some exclusion, and there's different points of view about that. I go through Ahmad's early chronology, and I describe all the different eras. A lot of interesting data comes out of this. So part of it was a learning experience for me, and part of it also complemented my teaching interests. I teach Middle Eastern studies, but sometimes I teach Islamic history and pre-1500 world history. So some of this came in handy, and you see how many dynasties were involved, how many states were involved. With the Ottomans, I go through the administrative divisions and how they changed. And I also talk a lot about Amman during World War One, as it was probably one of the most difficult cities for the British Army and their allies to take over, and they failed several times because, of course, of its hilly nature, which gave the Ottomans and their Circassian allies the chance to defend it quite well. So it was a really well-defended city that the Ottomans held on to up until the very end. I also talk about European exploration of the region and why they were interested in Transjordan, and I talk about the Ottoman goals as far as Amman is concerned, and for them it was a very important place, primarily because of its very strategic and central geographic location. This is Kamel Pasha, the vizier that I mentioned, who, I mean, should be credited to some extent with the founding of modern Amman, at least. But you never see him celebrated or mentioned at all. As the map from, I'm sure some of you have seen these schematic maps of some of the tribes, the changing Ottoman designations, establishment of modern Amman, some pictures here. I'm close to finishing so that you can ask questions. And this is a representation of the theater in Amman, the Roman theater. And interestingly, some Circassians lived close by, and then Palestinians in 1948 used it also as a place of shelter. This is a picture of the railway, some Circassian houses near and in actually the theater. Picture from 1904, 1910. This is, I think, from Nufan Mood's book. And this is an interesting picture of Amman taken by the German Air Force on the 9th of April, 1918. It's shot from a height of 1,500 meters. The arrow indicates north. And you can see the stream here, the sail, right? And you can see this Roman theater here. And I think the picture is important because it illustrates how much weight the Germans and Ottomans put on the city. They were taking pictures. They were trying to see if there were any Allied movements into the city. And they were able to defeat the Allied army several times. Sykes-Picot, in which, the British envisaged Amman as the center of a buffer that insulated the future the future Jewish homeland from the rest of the Arab region. You guys all know about that, Picot and Sykes, Hussein bin Ali and Henry McMahon, different interpretations of Sykes-Picot. I mentioned this in passing, Hijaz Railway and the mandates. As far as post-Ottoman developments, I also mention a lot, and I look at some memoirs from the time. There's a lot, actually. There are memoirs in English, there are ones in Arabic. Arif al-Arif has some papers at Oxford. I haven't seen those yet, but you'd be surprised how much material there is on this city. So it's really a call for other scholars to also help us out to navigate all of this. I'm going to stop here. And of course, I'll share the presentation. And I welcome any questions. And also, if you want to read part of my book, please email me. You can get my email from Surah, and I'll be happy to share that with you. And finally, just before I finish, I'd like to thank Professor Rami Bahir for this kind invitation. It was really nice of him and everybody involved and all the institutes involved in hosting this conference. Usually I'm in Amman in the summers and over the winter break, but unfortunately just the timing didn't coincide well. But next time I'll be with you in person. Shall we go for questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Marwan, for the presentation. And yes, we can go for questions. So I'm looking at the audience to see. I've got a comment.
Okay.
Actually, two questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marwan. Very interesting. And we're looking forward to reading the book, the same as we were very fortunate to reading your dissertation a while ago.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have a very specific question and another one. The specific question, when you were reading memoirs, did you come across Wasfi Mirza Pasha?
Yes.
And I would like if you could elaborate a little bit on his role and especially his house that he opened at a certain point in time for gatherings and so on, because I'm interested in this. And because as you have said, and also Muhammad Khalid said that how, for example, history of Amman is a history of intimidation because we're always compared to the classical Arab cities, and And I'm interested to actually understand the role of individuals such as Wasfi Mirsad Pasha. The other question is that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you wanted to grant voice to the role of the Ottomans, and Kemal Pasha is one example. But you also said that to acknowledge the role of the Ammani inhabitants. And I'm more interested to hear your intake on this issue in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a section on in the dissertation on Wasfi Basha, and the role that he played. I had, through a contact in Amman, I was able to get, I believe it was, this is a long time coming. That chapter I haven't looked at in a while, but I believe it was his memoir that I had, and talks about his role as a police chief in the city. But it's been such a long time that I have to revisit. That's one of the chapters I have to revise. So, but I still have a copy of that book, and I can share it with you, Rami. Uh, as far as the role of average inhabitants and of the Ottomans, I felt that it was really important to include both. The Ottomans, obviously, you can understand why, in the Arab nationalist narrative, you can understand why they have been excluded from, histories of Amman, or you just referred to in a passing, almost pejorative way, described as, promoting oppression, or that it was a stagnant time. But actually, as history is the study of change over time, and nothing is stagnant. It's a very ahistorical way of looking at the world. And the Ottomans did both good things and bad things in the Middle East. As far as Amman was concerned, I feel that they were the reason why settlement occurred, or resettlement, and they helped in settling people, and that led to a boom in the local economy. So, from my vantage point, that's a positive aspect of what they did. But of course, they are always referred to as imperialists and so on and so forth. And I understand that point of view as well. As far as average citizens, I looked at a lot of newspapers, some memoirs. I interviewed older people, and of course, bearing in mind the pitfalls and flaws of doing oral history. But I tried to gather as much as I could to shed light on just ordinary people and how they helped move the city forward, and how they lived, how they adapted. One thing I found that was interesting was that there was a lot of mixing in terms of business associations between, for example, Circassians and Syrians and Palestinians, and indigenous East Bank Jordanians rather early on, um, which suggests that these ethno-national differences were handled extremely well, extraordinarily well in Amman. And I find it shocking that this has not been illuminated in the field of Middle Eastern studies in the West. It's just a shocking omission. Part of the omission is that the interest was just not there. There was this quick dismissal, as Professor Khalid correctly described. There was this easy dismissal of Amman as an imperialist hub, as just a creation of the British. And this is terribly unfair to people who lived there, regardless of their origin, and who worked hard to build that city up. So I have some stories about that as well.
Okay, thanks for the answer to your questions. And I have one question from the chat that I will read out. It's from the audience, which is online.
Yeah.
And it comes from Omar. And he says, you may be familiar with Mohammed Rafi's work in collecting Amman's building permits and rent contracts, covering the period from 19 to 1950. I wonder if you have any views on how such sources may be utilized in furthering the new narratives of Amman's history, especially the people.
Yeah, of course. I'm familiar with Muhammad Rafi's books, and what he did was amazing. I mean, he just went through so many sources. You know, he put together rental deeds, ownership records. Interestingly, for example, my father's uncle, which we never knew about this. You know, we thought that he had died at a young age, and he was, you know, a Palestinian, and we never thought that he lived in Amman. I mean, we didn't know that. And I was going through Muhammad Rafi's book, one of his books, and I found that my father's uncle, who we don't know a lot about, had lived in Amman in the 1920s, probably to do business for a short period of time, because I found his name, that he came from Palestine to Transjordan, or whatever we want to call it at the time, to rent an apartment and to do some work there. So that's that, you know, just as a small, very trivial example, but it's telling because it shows you that, you know, there was a lot of Levantine exchanges. You know, there were people. The region was much more porous than it is now. They were going all over from Lebanon to Syria to Jordan to Palestine, etc., and you know, doing trade and trying to do work. So yeah, Muhammad Rafi's books help a lot in this. The only problem is that, you know, that material, one of the problems with a lot of the Jordanian scholarship on Amman is that it's highly empiricist. So, you know, there's a lot of the records there, and there's description of, no, I'm not talking about Muhammad Rafi, I'm talking just in general. A, B, C, D, E. You know, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And there isn't a lot of, um, essay type writing that takes out or gleans the anthropological detail about people's lives, and that narrates it in a way that's compelling. You know, we haven't had that yet, and we're trying to do it. It's not so easy because the records, as I've mentioned, are eclectic. There's many different types of records, and it takes a lot of work to put them together. But Muhammad Rafi's books, that's a very monumental achievement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Marwan. I think we close the Q&A session at this point, and we thank you very much for staying up that late or getting up that early, and have a nice night if you have time to sleep then. And
Thank you.
sorry for being that late, but it was great to listen to you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.